Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's event, Key Skills and Best Practices, a recap of top sessions from Automation Guild Conference 2017. My name is Adi and I'm the event's moderator. Today's speaker is Joe Colantonio. Joe is a test architect for a Fortune 100 company, author of the UFT API Testing Manifesto, frequent speaker at testing conferences, and the host of the popular podcast TestOps, which you should definitely check out. Joe is also the founder and host of Automation Guild, the first ever online conference dedicated to test automation excellence that took place during January. Just before we kick off, a little bit of housekeeping, not house cleaning. That's not happening right now. I want to do a quick sound check. So if you could raise your hand, if you can hear the sound, and if you can hear me okay, that would be great. Just raise your hand. You have that on the GoToWebinar control panel on your right. Okay, great. I see a few hands raised, so that's perfect. I'll take it as sound working. Feel free to ask questions during the webinar. You can do that in the GoToWebinar control panel on your right. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the Q&A session at the end. The webinar is being recorded and the link to the recording will be emailed to you tomorrow. For optimal viewing experience, I also recommend you close off any unnecessary apps running in the background. And if you encounter any technical issues, please send me a private message in the chat room, also in the control panel to your right, or in the questions panel, and I will try to take care of it as soon as possible. So I think, Joe, I think that everyone is here. Housekeeping is taken care of. I think that we can start.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you, Adi. All right. So first, I just want to start off by thanking Applitools for having this webinar, but also being the platinum sponsor of the conference. They really helped me do different things with the conference I wouldn't have been able to do without them with a lot of advice, so I really appreciate that. So I want to share back a little information what happened out of the conference. So I want to share 12 top Automation Guild Conference skills and best practices that came out of the 2017 session. So as Adi mentioned, it was, as far as I know, the first ever online conference dedicated 100% to test automation. I'm not aware of any other conference that is completely online where people don't have to travel. And it was really a cool, unique situation. It was kind of a hybrid where I asked speakers ahead of time to record their sessions. So I had the best audio and video quality. I then uploaded them to a membership site so people could log in 2 weeks before the actual conference, view the sessions, write down the questions. And then during the actual week of the conference, I streamed live myself and all the speakers, and we had a Q&A session. So the attendees were actually able to ask some questions about their sessions or anything in general. So I truly tried to make it an attendee-led conference so that the attendees were the ones that really set the agenda with their questions. And I had a fantastic turnout. I mean, the attendees at this conference were top-notch. They really made it, I think, an excellent experience for myself. And like I said, it really was attendee-driven. We had 46 countries represented, so that's something you usually don't see in a on-site conference. All these different countries that you wouldn't even think of. A lot of countries from Romania, Germany, Finland. So it was a really good turnout. We had 751 attendees, and yeah, I was just so thankful for everyone that turned out and the quality of the attendees. Not only the speakers, but the quality of the attendees in the chat were helping everyone out. And so some of these slides are actually coming from comments that I got from attendees or what attendees may have written in the chat during the conference itself. We also, I had what I think is some of the best experts in the world in test automation. And once again, because it was all online, I was able to get some really, I think, top-notch speakers. We had the creator of Robot Framework, Pekka Clark. We also had Matt Wynn, who is the lead developer for Ruby Cucumber. Also, we had Alan Richardson. We had John Smart. We had the creator of Appium. We had John Samez, just a whole bunch of folks. Everyone was excellent, and everyone brought something to the table. So we also had a lot of people that maybe not have presented before, but because it was online, they were able to create their sessions and prepare and not have to travel. So I was able to get some people also that aren't part of the whole, automation circuit or test circuit. You see the same ones all the time. So I think I had a really good mix. Angie Jones, just fantastic speakers, I think. Katrina. So some of these slides, I'm not going over every single session. I'll pull out some highlights, but like I said, I'm not trying to take away from any of these sessions. All these sessions were awesome, but I just had to pull out some highlights from each one of them. And so I picked 12 of the top ones that really resonated with me and the people that attended. All right, so one of the first things I really wanted to focus on with the conference was I didn't want it just to be a conference about Selenium. Right, there's already a conference for that, and it's an excellent conference. I also didn't want it just to be on vendor tools, right, because there's HP Discover if you just wanted to see HP tools. I wanted to really incorporate all types of automation. So I broke out the conference into five days, and each day was like a theme. So the first day was frameworks. So any kind of framework. It didn't have to be Selenium. We had Gauge, we had Robot Framework, Cucumber, all these different frameworks that can be used with other things other than Selenium, LeanFT. And then I did best practices as the next day. And then I did one on mobile technologies, also one on DevOps, and all types of automation and performance testing. So I really tried to get a breadth of automation that wasn't just focused on one type of technology or tool, so that we can get really good discussions going on. So one of those sessions was on visual validation testing. So one of the things that a lot of people struggle with, or even on my podcast when I talk to them, as we move towards rapidly developing software quicker and quicker and try to ship it faster, we need ways to get better coverage. And I understand that automation is not the perfect solution, but I don't think you can succeed with modern software development without automation. And there are certain things that you could automate that you may have manual right now because you don't know, because there aren't any reliable ways to do it that you may know of. And one of those ways, though, that can help you is visual validation testing. So I guess before I get into it, I know you're on Applitools, but just in case you don't know what visual validation testing is, visual validation testing really is more of a quality assurance activity that's meant to verify the UI of an application, make sure it appears correctly to users. And I think a lot of people confuse this with tools like Selenium and QTP, and those really are designed more for functional testing of your application, driving a user through a UI using a mouse and browser, but it doesn't test the actual way the application looks to a user. So it doesn't tell you how it looks, the shape, size, and color of, say, a button or the way your fonts are. So it only looks at what you tell it to look at and what you tell it to assert. So with visual validation testing allows you to actually look at a website and tell you whether or not there's any visual differences. And one of the tools, Applitools, like I said, they were a sponsor. They also did an awesome session by Adam Carmi on advanced test automation techniques for responsive apps and sites. So another reason why you'd want to use something like visual validation testing is all the different kinds of applications now that people use, the different devices. So your application needs to look good on a watch, right? It needs to look good on an iPhone 6. It needs to look good on an Android device, a Mac, 27-inch screen, or a little laptop. All these different screens, it really needs to be responsive designs to really scale down to all these different situations. And actually, honestly, functional testing does not give you the information you need to make sure that your app is doing that. So Adam gave a really good session on how you can use visual validation testing to test your responsive apps. And also another session was by Peter Kim on how you can automate your localization tests. This is another area that I normally see teams usually have as a manual test because it's so difficult to automate using traditional functional test tools like QTP or Selenium. And a lot of times when you do use a tool like QTP or Selenium to validate something, it's only validating a DOM that's being rendered or the HTML. It's not really rendering or telling you what it really looks like if there's a real visual bug. And Peter Kim really does a lot of enterprise type testing, and he gave a demonstration on how he uses it for localization testing. So testing against all these different languages, how your application looks when it's running in French as opposed to English, or running in Chinese. And also, Pina Kim brought up a good point, and a lot of the people in the chat brought up a good point, that it's able to catch things that you normally couldn't catch without visual validation testing. And localization testing is one of those things that is very notorious for being very difficult to automate. And one of the key things out of the conference was how more and more folks are actually incorporating visual validation testing into their test suites to really cover more tests, have better coverage in the end, so that we can develop our software faster and deliver it faster, because we have confidence now in these other techniques we can use to test it and make sure that it's actually, not only is it testing correctly functionally, but that it looks correctly to users. And there's a whole types of things that could occur if your application or your, and it may seem trivial, but if your application doesn't look right, like if it's just loading up links and it's missing all the images, to a functional test tool it may look okay because it's able to find all the elements because it's using element IDs, but from a visual perspective it looks broken. And if a user goes to your website and sees that, even though functionally they may be able to interact with your application, if it doesn't look right visually, they're most likely going to bounce, and then you're going to lose a customer. So that's another reason why visual validation testing was one of the big topics there during the Automation Guild conference. So one of the quotes that came up during the conference, I did a survey after, a lot of people said this, but I just pulled this out, it was that they were exposed to a lot of tools and techniques that they weren't aware of. And that really was one of my main goals of the conference. Like I said, I didn't want to just focus on one test tool or technique. So one of those tools was visual validation testing. So of course, I get a lot of questions about other types of tools. And this is one of those examples of a conversation that came up from the attendees themselves. I didn't plan to talk about Galen, but someone in the audience actually had experience with Galen. They knew the creator of Galen, and they actually introduced me to him, and I was able to interview him for TestOps. So I was able to ask Adam Carmi about his thoughts of Applitools versus tools like Galen, and then actually asked the actual developer of Galen the same question. So it's kind of interesting. The reason why I brought this up is that a lot of times another thing that came up is people confuse tools, or they try to use one tool for one thing or for everything. You know, one tool that does everything. And in my experience, it doesn't work that way. You usually need to cobble together a bunch of different technologies to create a solution. And one tool that might be right for your team may not be right for another. So there's also no one tool that's correct. So in the chat during Adam's session, a lot of people were asking, well, how about Galen? Doesn't Galen do the same exact thing that Applitools does? And luckily, Adam knew about it, and Adam just brought up the point that actually tools like Galen, there's a lot of tools like Galen that aren't really visual validation testing tools. They really don't, like I say, test everything. So when I say test everything is when you're doing a functional test and you need to check, say that a color appears a certain orange, or that a font is a certain size or a certain kind, you need to assert that, and you need to actually call it out. If it's not asserted, it's not checked. Well, with Applitools or visual validation testing in general, it is checked because you usually just use something like a check window and it will check any visual differences. So it saves you a lot of time. So a lot of people also get this confused with responsive design tools. And responsive designs, Applitools can help you with that also, but there's other tools, smaller tools like Galen, that are more suited for a UX engineer or developer. So once again, not every tool is right for everyone. So if you have a small team or a team of just UX engineers, and you have a fairly simple application, you probably could get by using Galen. But if you want to do true visual validation testing, you need to use a tool like Applitools because they're two different tools. So it was just interesting. I just asked Adam, what his thoughts were about Galen, and he actually said Galen was awesome. He really enjoyed it, and then he gave the 3 reasons why it really didn't fit the needs of a visual validation testing tool, because 1, it doesn't test everything. 2, it doesn't test what is shown to the user, so it doesn't treat it. It just looks at the DOM or the HTML. It doesn't actually look at the images and make sure that they're exactly the same. And it's really hard to validate a large site. So I said, okay, maybe, Adam, he's a vendor. He's just saying that because, he's Applitools, right? Even though I don't know that. I know Adam. Great guy. The whole company's awesome. But I'm just thinking, some people probably, if you didn't know Applitools or Adam, you'd probably think that. So I said, all right, let me ask the actual creator of Galen the same question. So I got Ivan on my Test Talk show, and it was interesting. He actually said the same thing. He said Applitools is awesome if you're doing visual validation testing. Galen is not a visual validation tool. It really is more suited for UX engineers and developers, and it doesn't really do image comparisons. It really does things like layouts. For example, you specify a layout that shows a button should be centered, and it should only be the width of 20% of your screen resolution. So if you run it against different browser sizes, it'll tell you whether or not that 20% is broken. So it's not really checking images, even though it can add image checks. It's just a completely different tool, I guess, is my main point. I don't mean to go on and on about this, but it was just an interesting thing that, like I said, what I loved about the conference, it was attendee-led, and Galen was not on the topic, was not on the agenda, but someone in the actual chat said, hey, how about Galen? And then I was able to actually get the creator of Galen later on Test Talks, and then ask them that information, and then share it with the folks. When you join the Automation Guild, you get access to a private Slack channel. Share them that information. So it's not only were they getting information in real time, but also I could do some research after and give them that information later. So it was really great that way, because a lot of times when you're creating a conference, you may just put it together based on what you would like to see, but a lot of times when you get together, it was awesome because the attendees were actually telling me what they want to know more of. So the next big question I always get asked, or I got asked after the conference, and another thing that came out of the conference was, okay, I know about Applitools, I know about Galen. Once again, I'll be upfront. I use Applitools. I work for a very large company. It's an enterprise company, and we need to use it against all types of technologies and groups, so it's a great solution for us because it covers all our scenarios. But there may be cases where you have a specific small team that uses one tech stack or one type of technology, and maybe there may be another tool out there for you that gives you the benefit of visual validation testing, but you don't have to invest in another tool like Applitools. You can get a tool that ties directly into your tech stack maybe. So what I did is I got so many of these questions, I just created a resource on the top 21 free visual validation tools that you can use to get visual validation incorporated into your frameworks. And there's a link here. If you went to this link at the bottom, you'd be directed to my blog post that actually shows the different tools. And the tools basically come in two different versions. You have the code-based, which I think most people on this call are probably familiar with. We're actually incorporating it into your test suite or your code. So if you're coding in Java, you would import a library, and then you would interact with the methods in that particular library. Or there's config-based ones where it's just a setting or a tool I use and just set up settings, and it's not coupled to your code. So I just had a collection of tools that I found, and what I also did was, here's another tip that came out of the conference. Whenever you're looking into an open source tool, you always want to make sure that the community is active, right? Because you don't want to invest in an open tool that it turns out there's no investment in it. There's no one helping keeping it alive. There's no one looking at bugs. So what I did, kind of like, it's not scientific. I just looked to see how many stars or ratings it had within GitHub. So I rated them from 1 to 10, 1 being the most ratings in GitHub to 10 being the least. And that just gives you a kind of sense of, okay, how active is this community? If I did pull this into my framework, how much support is it for that particular tool base? Once again, another reason why you may want to invest in a tool like Applitools, where you get that benefit of support after. But if, like I said, you have a completely open source, you want to use something specific to, I don't know, say you're doing a PHP, right? You could probably use something like visual caption to incorporate, and maybe you can get away with that. But the main point here is, and the main point of the conference was, as we shift right, we want to get more coverage. And the only way we get more coverage is to automate some of the things that are currently manually tested. One of those ways to do it is to use visual validation testing. All right, so the next takeaway was, and this was a pretty popular session, was with Dave Heffner, and you've probably seen, I think Dave Heffner has been doing this circuit now with this particular talk. The talk he gave at Test Talks was tailored to Automation Guild, was tailored to Automation Guild, but a lot of the information he covered is already available online. So I think even he may have done one for Applitools and maybe one for what do you call it, Sauce Labs. So he has a slide deck out there. If you did a search for how to grade your Selenium test with Dave Hefner, you'd pull up his slide deck also. And what Dave did is really step through the core tenets of what he considered what makes a good test, right? What makes a good page object design. And he uses a grading system to objectively tell you, okay, my scripts do this and this, so therefore I know I can give it a grade of A to F on how well I'm developing my tests to make them maintainable and reliable. So this is, of course, any automation conference you go to, flaky tests is one of the #1 things that people complain about. And so Dave came up with this awesome approach of how you can actually objectively use something to say, okay, let me look at my test and see, is my framework really minimizing unreliable test? And it was really just a cool technique. We did have other speakers about how you can make reliable frameworks like Angie Jones and Nikolai, which were more low level, where they actually walked you through code, how you create a reliable framework. And Dave took it more from a high level. But once you have your tests created now, how can we judge those tests? This is really helpful for someone like myself, like I said, that works in an enterprise situation where I have 8 to 10 sprint teams. Some of you may have. I spoke to someone on TestOps the other day from Paycheck. He supports 100 sprint teams, right? So when you get to that point where you scale out, you need a way to tell, okay, I can't look at all the code, but is there a way I can grade these tests and maybe just see what I should focus on to refactor? And grading your tests is one great way. So Dave actually came up with the rubrics. And I don't know how well you can see this. Like I said, if you were to go to Google and typed in Dave's name and typed in how to grade your test, you'd come up to the slide deck. 2 main things he went over is, you start with 100. So you give yourself 100, your test script 100. And then once you have that endpoint, then once you have 100 points, for every infraction, you start taking it away. And then based on that, you can grade your test on whether or not it's an F or an A. And so he has some basic things that he looks for of what he considers what is a bad practice compared to a good practice that you can apply to your tests themselves. Like say you have hard-coded your Selenium locators in your tests, right? That's bad. You want to deduct points for that. Or your page objects. Your page objects greater than 200 lines of code. So that breaks a principle of keeping your classes as small as possible, so you deduct yourself. So it's just a good way to keep yourself and your teams honest with, okay, not only are we creating automated tests, but what's the quality of these tests? Are they going to be easy to maintain, or are they going to be hard to maintain? And it could also give you a heads up on, okay, down the road, this is going to be a maintenance nightmare, so we need to add some tech debt stories to make sure we're dealing with factoring later on. So that's another key thing that came out of the conference was not only is it important that we create tests, right? But more automated tests we're going to have to probably create as we go towards rapid development, but we need to create tests that also are reliable and maintainable. And how do you find that out? Well, here's one way you can do that. And what I like about this concept also, I don't know if this is possible, but when I check in code now to our continuous integration environment, our developers have unit tests, and we have different tools that run. So we do a check style, and that check style checks to make sure it matches the enterprise-wide check that we have of how the standard should be for how people write code. And then we do like covariety test and unit test. It'd be cool if you could incorporate something like this into your CI system to say, not only did you check in automation code, right, but oh, wait a minute, you have hard-coded sleeps here. You have, come up with a way where you can flag it. Maybe if you got a grade of D or C or below, you don't allow them to check in automation code. Like I think something like this, if you could somehow incorporate it into your continuous integration environment, would also be a really cool, huge win. So I think this is a really great takeaway. A lot of people talked about this after the conference. So another interesting thing that came out was, this was kind of controversial, actually. We went over a session on Screenplay pattern. I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with Screenplay pattern, but so John Smart is the creator of Serenity. Serenity is one of my favorite automation frameworks. It allows you to do awesome automation, but also does awesome reporting out of the box. So it acts like a wrapper on top of things like JavaScript or Java or JBehave or Cucumber JVM, and adds abstraction layers that makes it easier to write more maintainable code. So he didn't come up with the Screenplay pattern. Anthony Macano, I think, came up with it. And I think it really does represent what is the next generation of page objects. So the page objects are good to start with, but in general, page objects really cause a lot of times when you're dealing with a lot of teams with page objects, it's like a bad code smell almost. And what I mean by that is when you look at their page objects, they have page objects that are like thousands of lines of code. So even though it's trying to encapsulate some reuse, a lot of teams aren't creating page objects that really are fitting into like the solid principle, where you really want to make a single responsibility type thing. It's open, it's like a closed principle. It really doesn't have so many dependencies. When you look at page objects, a lot of times teams have dependencies on all these other libraries. So it's a good place to start when you're writing your automated test, but over time, a lot of times if you're not being careful, these page objects grow out of control, and it adds to making tests unmaintainable and unreliable. So the next wave of page objects is the Screenplay pattern. And really what it does, it really takes page objects and it really chops them down into really, really tiny small pieces. And in doing so, it makes your tests really easy to read, and it helps foster a more, it encourages better testing habits and better design tests. So here's an example. Like I said, John Smart gave a hands-on example during the conference. He brought up code and started from scratch to show you how to do this. This is just from one of his slides where when you're dealing with a Screenplay pattern, you do something like an actor. Like an actor has a stage. So I work for a hospital application. So we have different doctors. So if you're familiar with personas, we may have like Dr. John, and Dr. John might be able to do X number of activities or see X number of exams. So anytime I say Dr. John, everyone in the team knows what I'm talking about. They know all the data associated with Dr. John, all the things that can happen with Dr. John. And then we may have Dr. Joan. So with the Screenplay pattern, you create this thing called an actor, and then actors can do certain goals. They want to perform an exam, look at an exam, or in John's example, he was showing them how you interact with the application Get Milk. So you want to add a to-do item. So that would be a type of goal. And then goals create tasks. So a task is actually you want to record an item, you want to filter a list. And tasks then call interactions, which are more lower type technology or lower type functions that actually implement what you want to do with that task. So it really breaks out your task really well, and it makes it more readable. So if something goes wrong, it makes this almost readable DSL where if someone's looking at the code, it reads almost like complete English, like James attempts to add an item called buy some milk, right? So it makes things very concrete. And here's another thing that came out of the conference that a lot of people take for granted, I think. And that is how readable are your automated tests. And the reason why that's important is when a test fails, if you can't figure out why it failed within, say, 10 minutes, and you have, like for my example, I have 1,600 tests, right? Say 400 of them fail. I mean, I do not have the time in the day to check 400 tests. So if it takes me more than 10 seconds, it takes me 10 minutes, if I have to step through the debugger to find out why it failed, that's going to create unmaintainable tests because I'm not going to be able to keep up with it. But when you create your tests, when you break out your page objects into the Screenplay pattern, when something fails, it's very, very exact on what failed. If this failed, I know that an attempt to add an item called buy some milk failed, and it helps me pinpoint exactly where to look to help start debugging. So that's one of the side benefits of using something like the Screenplay pattern. So of course, I mean, I think, and I think a lot of people said, well, this seems very technical. And it is I think it's a lot more technical than a page object. But if you put up that upfront work first, in the end, later on, it'll become more readable. You get all these other benefits out of it. And so it started this whole, not a war, but just a. So what happened basically is everyone in the chat wanted me, every time I had someone on after John, say, hey, do you know about the screenplay pattern? What were your thoughts on it? So, Angie Jones had a session, so the people in the audience wanted me to ask her what her thoughts were on the screenplay pattern. Dave Hefner, Nikolai, all these people that really are Selenium experts, what their thoughts were. And a lot of them really were kind of hesitant, saying, it's kind of new. They haven't seen it in action themselves. They wanted to wait first to see what's going on before they actually committed all the way to it. So this is some Twitter that I released an episode on my test talks called the screenplay pattern and went over these different conversations that were going on. And John actually said he actually does this in the real world. He has an example. He's running 150 test cases, and it really, really makes it so rather than have 300 page objects, he has 50 really lightweight page objects. And he's seen that his code has become a lot easier to understand, a lot more easy to maintain. So key takeaway, if you haven't seen it yet, I would just tell you, hey, do a little POC of a screenplay pattern, compare it to your current way you're doing automation, and see if it gives you the benefit that you think it will. I would definitely think it's worth looking into. So another kind of shocking thing to me, just because I also use behavior-driven development in my organization. And so we have Matt Wynn. He is the, like I said, lead developer for Ruby for Cucumber. And once again, when we talk about BDD, there's a lot of best practices. We always have these conversations if you're a tester. Well, there really are no best practices. There just are good practices. This is one of those things where, in general, when you're using BDD, I think that you should keep your BDD at a high level. So you don't talk about clicks. You don't talk about objects. That is something that's pushed down the tech stack later on. How you implement it is not the concern of your user, right? It should be really high level. As a user, given I'm a radiologist, when I log in, I should see my exams. It's not go to this URL, click on my username, enter in my username, click on this tab off. All that implementation detail should be pushed down later in the stack. But, Matt brought up something. I thought he was really going to be an ideologue saying, no, that is definitely the way you should do it. And I guess, his answer kind of shocked me that it's up to the team. So if for some reason, whatever works for your team, so if your team thinks or cares about actually the application from the point of view of clicks and drop-downs and what they're doing, so if you're documenting it as a whole team, getting everyone's concerns, if that's really what they want, if you find the consensus that people want information like clicks and drop-downs, then that's what you should do, because that's what the team cares about. And Matt gave it an extreme example of how a team was just UX designers, right? So they really did care about clicks and drop-downs. So that was something that was important to them. So even though as a good practice, I don't think you should want to do that, there are occasions where you may want to do that. And also Angie Jones brought up in the chat, there was a link in the chat as this was going on. She wrote a blog post the same way that, there are a lot of these, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Well, in fact, if it works for you, right, wave your freak flag high and do it. But I still would kind of be, if you're working with a lot of teams, you want to get the whole team buy-in before you do something. Do the right thing, get the team buy-in. I would try to keep things as high level as possible, but if the team really does actually care, they are getting value from information about clicks and drop-downs, then go ahead and do it. The only reason I try to stay away from it also, if there's a refactor and something changes from a click to a tab, if you have, in my example, we have, We have 165 feature files and 1,600 scenarios. I would have to touch all 1,600 scenarios if that was the case, and I want to avoid that. But if your team actually cares about that and they want to document that information, then go ahead and do it. Just something that came out of it that I kind of thought, okay, maybe there are reasons where you would want to keep implementation details in. If it works for your team, if that's what's important to them, then go for it. Now, I've talked about this before on other webinars, but it's something that came out once again during this conference. And it's really how it's a strange world now where before I used to just have vendor tools and open source tools, and they're always banging against one another. We only use open source tools and we only use vendor tools. And really what's happening now is vendors really are embracing open source tools. And more newer vendors are just starting off from the notion saying they're going to be used in open source tools. So something like Applitools doesn't care. It works with Java. It works with Python. It works with all these technologies. It's totally agnostic, right? You're not stuck using a certain tool or technology with them. Same thing with other tool vendors now. Like HP before, they only did QTP. And there was no way. You'd have to use VBScript to create your test. And so they're starting to loosen up more and more. And now it's just like they're just completely unabashed supporters of open source tools. We had a few sessions from HP. So they have a tool called LeanFT. I don't know how many people are using that, but it's a great tool that really incorporates into your developer's ecosystem. So you can use the same IDEs, the same languages as your developers, but you get this extra support of using a framework that already supports things out of the box for you that you don't have to develop yourself. Because when we talk about Selenium, Selenium is just an API. You really need to create a lot of custom code and add functionality to Selenium to create an end-to-end solution. And vendors can act as a wrapper to add these things. So they can add object spies, object repositories, reporting features, things that you don't have to develop from the ground up. And so it was really shocking about HP is that you can actually run them on Linux now. You can use TestNG. And you can use all these other vendor tools. They also mentioned that they're working on an implementation of using Python to be able to create your test in. So you can create automated tests using Python. So another thing with Selenium, Selenium is only for browser-based testing. If you do any sort of other testing, if you work for a large company, if you need to test a Windows application, you're not going to be able to use, you can't use Selenium. So what do? So here's one way. You can use a tool like LeanFT and still use Selenium within the same solution and get the integration of both the client and browser-based applications within one tool, one technology. If you know UFT, also the API is almost completely the same than with LeanFT. So if you don't know a lot of coding, it's not really Java-based or C#-based, the API would be very familiar to. So just one thing that came out, a lot of tools, vendors are doing this. When we see later on, there's performance testing tools, like BlazeMeter that has an open source project also. So this is just one thing that I think is going to become more and more common over time. Vendors really embracing open source tools and technologies. And it's okay. It's okay to use vendor-based tools. A lot of times people are like, we only use open source tools. But really, if you want to get support, if you want to get functionality that you don't want to spend a lot of time with, it's really great that these vendors are starting to embrace open source tools because you get the best of both worlds. You can use the open source technologies and you can get the support, you can get the functionality that you don't have to develop yourself. It's something that they've practiced for years. You can just bring it into your framework and get up and running really quickly. So I'm always shocked at how much, I don't think I could talk long, but it looks like I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to speed up a little. But another thing that came up is the test data strategy. So a lot of times when tests are flaky, there's many reasons why tests can be flaky. One of them can be you're not using the right synchronization methods. So you're just loading up your application and you just stop trying to bang on it. You don't say, well, okay, wait, is this field available? Is the DOM fully loaded? So that's one reason your test may be flaky. But another one that I think a lot of people don't realize is their test data causes the test to be flaky. So in my example, once again, we have 8 sprint teams, 8 different environments. We have one continuous integration environment. It may work in that one team's environment, but as soon as any other team tries to run their test or they try to run it in the continuous integration environment, it fails. Why? And the reason why is test data. So we had a really great session by Paul Merrill on test data strategies. He gave 4 different ways that you can use test data strategies to help make your tests more reliable, more repeatable. This is really important when you're trying to run against different environments. And it just makes it so your test, if you're hard coding data, you're going to have problems maintaining it. So he also gave all these different ways that you can try to minimize these types of issues to make your tests more atomic, where you can run against any environment and have the data you need because you're following these different principles. So he has 4 different ways that he goes over. I have a blog post on this that you can reference. We probably don't have time today to go over it. Or you could check out the Automation Guild and check out the session. And he goes over these different layers in detail on how you can create data to make your tests more reliable. So of course, a big discussion goes on all the time, especially during this particular conference, was automation management. So we had some best practices sessions. So we had one by Katrina Clokey. We had one by Melissa Tondi on automation and management, automation in an agile environment, and went over a lot of things like, how do you decide what to automate? How do you choose a tool? How do you ask for investments? So there are a lot of things that people say, oh, we're going to automate everything, and they don't think about, okay, what does that mean? So there are certain conversations that you need to have with your management to make sure that they're aware of the commitment that's needed for automation. Automation is not, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all your issues. And a lot of times when you start implementing automation, there's not going to be an immediate increase in productivity. It usually goes down in some cases because you have to ramp up. So there's a decrease in productivity. And then as time grows, right, your test grows, you need to maintain these tests. That takes time. It takes people with a certain skill set, right? So a lot of times management doesn't know this. They just want to see automated tests, and it's up to us to say, wait a minute, first off, does it make sense to even automate this? Is this a risk area? Would it be better off with real eyes on it? And if so, why are we automating it? Or it takes a lot of time and effort to automate it. We only run it once every year. It doesn't make sense to automate it. So Katrina went over a bunch of different ways and tools that she approaches management to get their buy-in and to explain to them what is automation, because you don't want to have a manager that's just 100% automation and you just go ahead and do it, because in the end you're going to be the one stuck maintaining these things. So there's certain tools, techniques, and questions you want to ask before you actually start implementing that code. And so like I said, there were a lot of things that came out of this. A lot of people are talking about the time involved in automation, the risk involved if you're automating something and you're not having the actual eyes on that themselves. Maybe Applitools can be used, but it may be something that's critical to your, like you work for a hospital and this something could cause a hazard. You probably want a real person looking at it. You need to tell your management those types of issues. And it really is a team effort. Another thing that came out of both Melissa and Katrina's sessions, based on their experience with multiple sprint teams, is if you don't have a whole team effort helping with the automation effort, it's most likely not going to be successful. So that was another key takeaway. A lot of people that were attending also wrote that in the comments as well. So like I said, Selenium is just for browser-based automation. So I want to cover things that weren't just Selenium-based. So a lot of people don't know there's actually frameworks out there that help you automate non-browser applications. We had a great session by Majek on the White framework. If you're not familiar with the White framework, it's an open source framework that allows you to automate WPF, Silverlight, window applications. And you can use C# to create your tests. So it's really cool. I have a team in my company that's using behavior-driven development with Cucumber, not Cucumber, but SpecFlow, which is the Cucumber implementation of BDD, and they use White to interact with their application, which is not a browser. There's also this cool new beta WinApp driver, which takes advantage of Appium, but allows you to write tests in any language binding to interact with apps on Windows. So not only browsers, but actual applications like calculators. So this is something that's in beta form. This came up in the, once again, I was talking about the White framework and presenting it, but people in the audience were saying, hey, have you heard about this app? So this was cool. This is a good discovery, this WinApp driver. You should check it out if you have to do any sort of automation that's not just browser-based. All right, of course, as we go more and more towards continuous integration, continuous delivery, we want to handle performance testing. And that's one of the last barriers usually, is performance testing still uses a lot of the manual testing processes that most people are familiar with. You need to have a full environment. You need to have everything set up. It takes a while to monitor. Sometimes you have to wait till you're into production. And so Michael Sage gave an excellent session on using something called Torres. So Torres is by BlazeMeter. And BlazeMeter, once again, is a vendor, but they maintain this open source tool called Torres that allows developers to write their tests in YAML. So it's really can describe a full-blown script in about 10 lines of code. And it's a big leap forward from having the old days of starting up LoadRunner and creating this big vendor-specific recording scripting tool They can use YAML using natural language to create their test. And this is important because as you start having sprint teams involved in performance testing, not everyone may be a performance testing expert, but if you can use something like Torres using YAML files, that can help you get faster creating performance tests and incorporating it into your continuous integration environment. I actually got so many questions about performance testing that I'm going to be putting on a separate conference just for performance testing called Perf Guild in July, and that's something that's just focused on performance testing, something that came out of the conference. And like I said, I'm running out of time, so let me go really quickly. Docker is a big thing now. Docker allows you to create images and allows you to spin up environments really quickly. So there's some examples of, as we talked about test management earlier, some teams, what they do is they create instances of their database in a Docker container or in Vagrant container, and they start with the known state. But because Docker is like small slices, it's not the full environment, it's not a full VM, it comes up really quick, so it makes your tests easier to maintain, easier to spin up all kinds of different environments. It gives you the flexibility that development and testers are used to create more flexible virtual machines. So it really makes your tests be able to spin them up and spin them down in a known state a lot quicker. And Dima Kovalenko went over some ways on how it helped his team really do better automation, and he pointed to some things out there already, Docker for Selenium and .ci, which brings the ease of how to build these configurations in the cloud using CI and Docker container and Jenkins easier. So really good session on that. If you haven't looked at Docker yet, if you go to Google Trends and look up Google Trends, I mean, Docker's taken off. So a key thing that came out of the conference was these type of technologies like Docker and Vagrant really are important that you start learning about. If you're an automation engineer, you really need to increasing your knowledge of all these types of things. Start moving towards a more holistic, high-level CI/CD, big picture, and making sure you have quality at all gates within your checking code, all the way to development, all the way to deployment. Using things like Docker can help you get there. And also another way to get you there is GUI test. I've been doing automation for 16 years. No matter what tool you use, GUI test automation is going to be hard to maintain and be reliable just because of the inherent nature of GUI test. So I try to avoid GUI tests whenever possible, and one way to do that is to use API testing. So Boz gave a really excellent session on API testing, use a tool called Rest Assured, and Rest Assured is a Java DSL that allows you to write tests using Java. But also during this session, once again, people that are attending were saying, hey, how about Postman or REST Sharp? So REST Sharp allows you to use C# to do your API automating test. Postman is a Chrome add-in, and there's this new DSL called Karate that someone told me about. So it's all these tools you can use to help you as you're going towards CI/CD development, as you're spinning up your automation efforts to focus less on GUI tests and more on unit tests, API tests, leverage more of those, you'll have more success. So those are the 12 main takeaways I took away from the conference. There's a lot more. It was an awesome conference, and it's still available. I got so many demands after that, I decided to keep the registration open because all the sessions are pre-recorded already. You can log in and see all the sessions and see all the chat and get access to the private Slack channel. And like I said, I'm just testing this out. This is going to be yearly now. Automation Guild, I'm going to have this as a yearly event. Once a year, definitely going to do it again. I'm also experimenting with this Perf Guild for just a smaller slice, just focusing on perf testing and see how that goes. And yeah, hit me up anywhere. Probably easiest way is joe@testtalks.com if you have any questions. All right, Eddie. Sorry to go. I went pretty fast, and I think we have 10 minutes left for questions.
Yeah, no, it's okay, and we have a lot of questions, and we'll go to as many as we can, of course, through as many as we can, of course. So I just wanted to say three things before we go into the questions. First of all, Dave Hafner's proven method to grading your Selenium tests. I put up a link to the full webinar recording Dave did with us a few months back, so you can check that out. It's in the chat. It's in the chat room in the GoToWebinar control panel, so you can check that out. Also, we got a lot of questions about visual testing, and I don't want to take all the Q&A session about visual testing. So I put up a link also in the chat room We're holding a visual testing masterclass every Tuesday. It's free. It's a 45-minute class, and I put up a link where you can register to it. So two goodies waiting for you in the chat room. So check that out. And also just a little tip about Automation Guild. I know that Joe doesn't like me giving that tip away, but since we are the platinum sponsor here, so Applitools is giving a coupon for anyone that registers to Automation Guild, so you can watch all the sessions and get all the information. And when you go in to register, you can put on in the coupon window there, you can type in Applitools, and you will get some awesome discount. Sorry, Joe. I had to tell them. I'm sorry. But it's our little secret. I'm sorry. So just for you, just for the webinar attendees, type in Applitools in the coupon area of Automation Guild 2017 and get some discount. Okay, so we had another question about Automation Guild, which was very interesting, from Carl. If I were to purchase the recordings from the 2017 Automation Online Conference, would I also receive all the chat window logs so I can see what everyone was talking about?
Yes. So what's great about the conference was I recorded everything, even the live sessions, and I captured all the chat. So when you log in, you'll see the days that each session occurred. If you clicked on one of these session days and expanded it, you would see all the different sessions for the speakers. If you click on the session will show you the speaker's pre-recorded session, and they also would show you the actual live chat. And if you go back to each day, I have a Q&A day 1 sessions. This will show you the recordings, and underneath the full live recording, there's a link for View Monday Chat. So if you clicked on the View Monday Chat, that will show you everything that was talked about, in the chat. So it's a PDF version, so you could follow along. You also get access, if you had any questions, to the Slack channel. And the Slack channel, we have members that attended Automation Guild members only. So if you had any questions, you needed clarification, or if you saw someone talking about something you want to know about, you could reach out to them in the Slack channel. So it's almost like a membership site also.
Okay, here's a question that actually we get a lot on our end, and it'd be interesting to hear what you say, Joe. So Jacob asked, why don't you have Sikuli in the list? Any reason? So
once again, Sikuli is really, it's not the same as visual validation testing. Sikuli is used for functional testing where you can't interact with an element because it doesn't have an element ID, or it's something that the browser can't interact with because it doesn't understand it. So use images to help you navigate through the application. It doesn't necessarily help you with actual visual validation. So the same roadblocks you get with functional testing, the same thing you get with Sikuli. Sikuli is a great tool. I love Sikuli. I use Sikuli, but it's not a traditional visual validation tool. I wouldn't use it as a visual validation tool. It also doesn't have the sophisticated algorithm like Applitools. Applitools was made from the ground up for visual validation testing. Use a tool like Sikuli. If there's any sort of pixel difference or aliasing, it's going to pick that up. You have to adjust different parameters to make it more reliable, but in my opinion, Sikuli is a functional test tool, not a visual validation tool. And I'm sure, like Adi mentioned, Adam has covered this in multiple sessions. She might have a better answer for you, but that would be my answer.
Great. Another question we got is, it's not a question, but Bikash actually wanted to know if there is any place to read about the 4 test data patterns that you spoke about, or if you have any links or any recommendations on how to get more information about that.
Absolutely. So I have a blog post. If you went to joecolantonio.com and you typed in test data, this will bring you to a post on what the 4 essential test data strategies are. I go over it, and also I have the interview with Paul Merrill, the person that gave the session at Automation Guild, and he goes over what it is. So you can either read a little bit about it. I even have the full, I think I have the full transcript here also, or you can listen to it, just download it. This is all free right here. So you miss out on the actual session of him showing you a real-world example, but you can get the gist of it from this blog post.
Okay, so we have some industry gossip here. A question from Seth. I heard HP has dropped efforts for further developing testing tools. Can you confirm that?
So I don't work for HP, and I would say that is not true. I mean, HP itself may, so HP, they sold the testing tools to Micro Focus. So I don't think that's true. HP itself may no longer develop test tools, but they sold off that division to Micro Focus, and Micro Focus will be developing the test tool. So he's right and he's wrong, as far as I know, in the sense that, yes, HP may not be developing it, but they sold off that division to another company, which I think will be developing it. And I've spoken with, at the conference, like I said, we had representatives from HPE. People asked them, okay, what's going to happen when you get, when everything moves over to Micro Focus? And they told us, whether or not it's true or not, they said nothing's going to change. The roadmap's going to stay the same. So, like I said, I don't work for HPE, but that's my understanding. Adi might have better information. That I don't know.
Well, you're in the industry. Maybe you heard something. I think the next question is about BDD. I think you mentioned it before, but Lucas is asking, you mentioned shifting right. What did you mean? I was under the impression that we want to test assumptions more with BDD and therefore shift left a bit.
Yeah, so I apologize. Let me clarify. So we want to shift left and we want to shift right. So with BDD, you want to shift left. I may have said shift right for that, but you want to shift left, meaning the earlier you can detect a bug in your code, the better off you're going to be. And that, to me, is what the main benefit of BDD is. It's the collaboration. So before you even write a line of code, before anything's developed, you talk with your developers, you talk with your product owners, you come up with scenarios. Is this really what the user wants? And as you're having those discussions, a lot of times you may say, you know what, this is a requirement as written. If we were to develop it, it would create a bug. So let's not do that. Let's change it. So that's a shift left. You're trying to find bugs before it even gets into the code, because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be and the more expensive it's going to be to fix. So if you wait to after your sprint, after you implement it and then go, wait a minute, we deliver this to the customer, it's not what they want, you're going to have to refactor. You're going to have to pull out that code. It takes a lot of effort. So shift left, finding bugs early in the development lifecycle. So when I said shift right is going to be, as we're doing continuous integration, continuous development, you want to be able to find things in production. So using monitoring and performance testing, being more proactive, that before a user actually finds the issue, that you're doing monitoring and going, wait a minute, the thing we just delivered to our customers having issues, they haven't reported the issues yet, but because we're running scripts and we're monitoring it, we need to roll back that deploy, go back to the old version. So that's a shift right. So I apologize. BDD is used for shift left, but also with performance testing, monitoring, you also want to do a shift right. So it's the whole shebang, shift left and shift right.
Okay, so we are out of time, but we'll take one more question. Should we learn JavaScript for Selenium?
I don't know. So I have a pretty good, it doesn't matter really. If you were to look up, I have a blog post, I'll put it in the show notes. It says which language binding should I use to learn Selenium. It's different, right? If I worked for a company and all my developers were Python experts, I would use Python, right? Because it's what everyone uses. It's probably the way I'll get better support. If your company uses JavaScript, then sure, maybe that's the way to go. I do know that JavaScript is becoming more and more important, so you may want to learn it just for it's going to make you more employable. But as to what language binding is the best language binding, it really is an individual and team decision. Use what's best for your team, whatever tech stack they're using, and what you think you're going to get up to speed quickest with, how you're going to get help, who's going to give you the most help. Maybe you have a C# expert, and maybe that's why you chose C#. So that's how I decide on what to use and what not to use.
Okay, I think unfortunately that's all the time that we have for today. So Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to recap your amazing Automation Guild conference. It was an amazing conference, and I want to thank everyone that joined us today. And I hope to see you at our next event.
Awesome. Thank you.